Well, good morning. Welcome to the StoryFest, and I'm just going to kick off the day by saying that I'm here to say that today is International Day of Peace. And so it's one of those things that we sorely need. And one of the things, we have a peace pole there, and it's about, may peace prevail on earth, may peace prevail in our community, may peace prevail in our schools, and may peace prevail in ourselves. And one of the things is, one of the highest forms of peace building is storytelling. And it started with, I guess, the Bible. And then, of course, it's a lot of stories about what you all are doing. And so I consider all you authors and storytellers as peace builders. And I'm Dennis Wong, and I consider myself as a Rotarian peace builder. And like everybody else, we all wear many hats. And one of my hats is United Nations, and United Nations Day of Peace. And the thing is, it's also a culture of peace. And when I talk about the culture of peace is the rejection of violence, and also the idea of solving problems through diplomacy. And the other thing that also, I have my Rotary hat. I'm a member of 2 million people, members around the world. And our mission is to advance understanding, goodwill, and peace. And one of the things that we talk about is really our motto is service above self. And the thing is, I think this idea of that our goal is to improve the quality of life, people's quality of life in the world, in our communities. And a lot of it is, again, connected with what authors are trying to do in telling your story. And one of the mindsets that we have is in our Rotary Club is that to do good, feel good, and have fun. So sometimes we get a little silly ourselves. And one of the things that people know is the fact that our Rotary Club has a great duck race in the last week of June. So if you're ever back in Westport, you can see our great duck race, which is right outside our thing. And also the other thing, I guess my last hat is as a person and a reader and going, because one of the things is I love food. And I know stories basically are food for the mind and for the soul. So one of the things that I really believe is the fact that you all authors, storytellers really have an impact on being peace builders. And one of the things that as a storyteller, you inform. Also the fact that you also provide the idea of influencing people's thinking, and also the ability to actually change behavior. And hopefully changing behavior from hate to love, from loneliness to belonging, and the idea of really moving towards from fear to trust, and hopelessness to hope. And so really, I appreciate what all you peace brothers are doing, storytelling. So thank you. And the thing is, I'll be around. And so if you've got any ideas on peace building from your stories and other things, please see me. And so I would just want to say thank you and have a great day. And one of the things remember is the fact that the idea of there's no higher calling than to be in the pursuit of peace. So thank you very much, and good luck to you.
Please join us in the forum for the next panel, Dangerous Visions, Dreams Across Universes.
Silence is great. This is...
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. So, I'm Alex Giannini. I'm one of the folks that puts on this festival, and some of you are familiar faces, so you know I say this every year. This is my favorite thing that we do at the library, so thank you so much for coming. We had a great night last night, and today is going to be just as great, so thanks for being here, guys. Okay, so we're going to start with just a killer panel. What a way to start the festival. StoryFest celebrates work across all genres and media, and our tagline is that we're a celebration of reading, writing, ideas, and community. So I'm gonna kind of pepper the conversation with those themes in mind. For anyone who might be new to StoryFest, this panel in particular represents exactly what the festival is all about. On this stage right now, we have everything from fantasy and SF to horror and comics represented. We have dystopian fictions, a bestiary, short stories, epic fantasies, and even a story that unfolds over the course of a card game. But let's start with introductions by way of early influences on your writing. So if we could go down the list, we'll start with Chris Golden. Can you talk about some of your early influences?
Early influences on my writing, way back at the beginning, strangely, probably Jack London was a huge influence on me reading as a kid. The sort of atavistic quality still informs a lot of the horror that I write today. And weirdly, like Doc Savage, pulp adventures, comics, The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, big, again, if you dig down, that's a big thing for my roots as well, so.
Thank you. Sarah Beth Durst.
Fairy tales, specifically Beauty by Robin McKinley, which is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, in which the Beast gives her a giant library full of all the books ever written and ever will be written, and I really, really want that library.
Peng Shepherd.
Started with science fiction and fantasy, and then as I got older, I did an MFA in creative writing, which is usually your reading lists are very literary, and so I think my style ended up as kind of a blend of those two things.
GennaRose Nethercott.
I watched a lot of Buffy from a very young age, and that sort of irrevocably broke me into writing speculative fiction. And my dad is a writer as well, so I grew up, ever since I was very little, he would read me classic poetry, and before I could physically write, he would have me dictate poems, and he would write them down and stuff them in a Lisa Frank binder. That it remains to this day, so yeah.
Jedidiah Berry.
I grew up in the little town of Catskill, New York, where they teach you the stories of Washington Irving, but I don't remember them telling us whether it was history or fiction, so Rip Van Winkle was, to me, something that really happened. This old man went into the mountains and slept for 20 years. And so, yeah, that was my kind of early sense of the fantastic in the world.
Djèlí Clark.
Yeah, sure. So probably when I was younger, my parents took me to the library every week. My sister and I, we came to the library and got as many books as we wanted. And so it just started from there. It was reading the Mouse and the Motorcycle, right? Like Beverly Cleary stuff and Danny Dunn books. And then I graduated to Madeleine L'Engle. And then I think in middle school, I read a Ray Bradbury book, The Illustrated Man. And I was like, what? Partly because my mother was a big Twilight Zone fan. And so when I read that stuff, yeah, I know every Rod Serling Twilight Zone, you name it, I know it, black and white. There's not one I haven't seen. And so between that and my father was really big, like the old Godzilla movies. Like he loved those, Godzilla, Monster Zero, that kind of stuff, and old Peter Cushing films. So grew up in all that, and then, just the reading. Today I would say, like, if there's stuff that really influenced my fantasy writing, Ursula Le Guin, Madeleine L'Engle, these were some big names. And then for this recent book, Forgotten Realms, if anybody remembers those D&D type one-off books, was big into those.
Thank you, guys. So I'm nothing if not shameless, so I'm going to plug two things. Since you mentioned the Twilight Zone, we have a Twilight Zone symposium next weekend, so check that out on westportlibrary.org. And the second thing I'm going to plug is Ursula K. Le Guin, because I figured she'd come up. So the official StoryFest bag this year has a quote from Ursula, which is, "We read books to find out who we are." That bag's available in the bookstore behind us, so go there next. Next up, I want to talk about some recent books, and then I'll move along a little bit. But Sarah Beth, what is cozy fantasy?
Cozy fantasy is a warm hug. It is all about the vibes. It's all about how it makes a reader feel. You're supposed to feel like you're wrapped in a blanket, a cat, preferably with wings, is sitting on your lap, it's snowing outside, you got hot chocolate, you got a book. It's supposed to be an escape. I firmly believe that escape is essential and not a bad thing and not frivolous. It's something we need to cope. We need to be able to take a deep breath. So that's what cozy fantasy is. It's a deep breath. This is my cozy fantasy, very subtly holding it up here. It's got lavender edges. And it's about a rogue librarian and her best friend who is a sentient spider plant.
You also called it, and in an interview, it's not saving a world, it's saving a soul.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Exactly. So I also write a lot of epic fantasy, and in that you're saving the world. You're changing the course of history. In cozy fantasy, we're saving one life. We're saving a heart. We're saving a soul. We're saving a spirit. And it tends to be about found family and second chances. And it's okay to be happy and to embrace joy and kindness and empathy and a lot of raspberry jam and cheese.
Since you mentioned changing the course of history, I'm going to go to Peng next because your latest book, I think it was a pandemic book in that you got the idea for it.
The
during
first one?
pandemic.
You mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
The first one.
So, can you talk? So that book was. You started thinking about like making choices and how choices affect everything, and I guess it was a reflection during the pandemic, right? So could you talk about that a little bit?
Wait, are we talking about the Book of M and the...
What was
because
the
that's
pandemic?
also about a pandemic.
Yeah, so wait, no, but I thought I read in an interview that you had, this latest book
Yeah.
was, the idea came during the pandemic, or am I wrong?
Oh, yes, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of, it's sometimes I don't know which book we're talking about because I wrote the Book of M, which is about a pandemic
Right.
before the pandemic, and then the pandemic happened, and a lot of things about early lockdown were kind of, I had just kind of dreamed similar situations in the Book of M. But then, yes, you're right. I started writing my latest book during lockdown because the idea came to me during lockdown. And yeah, it was, I think for a lot of writers, it was a really strange time because we were all, inside our same four walls and climbing them, and we kind of had nothing to think about except ourselves and our choices. Were we in the places we thought we would be? Were we happy? Could we change things? Should we even change things? Because sometimes I think, especially me, I have a tendency to, if I could change something, I will change it without really thinking through if that's actually the best path or not. And so that is kind of, that's my latest book, All This and More. That is where this came from. It's about a woman who's given the chance to go back in time and rewrite some of her past mistakes to change the way that her present life has happened. And that sounds great at first, but if you really think about it, it might not be.
Well, and it's a multiple path novel, right? So it's very interactive for the reader. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of the book and building that? It just must have been, I've heard you've said that you're a structure nerd, so I imagine writing the book was both fun and stressful.
Oh, it was so fun. Yeah, I mean, every book is stressful.
Right,
I think
right.
every book is totally stressful, but it was a lot of fun. So it is, like I said, it's a book about a person's happiness, her regrets, second chances, and so I didn't want you to just read that story. I really wanted to bring you into it. And so the way that I wrote it was that I built multiple paths into the novel. And so every time the main character, Marsh, is encountering a moment that she could change something about her past, you, the reader, actually have to pick which thing she changes, and then that will divert you to a different part of the story. So even though it is about Marsh, it's sort of about you too, because you are the one that's choosing what she does.
And I want to talk a little bit to everybody about world building, especially, we'll stay on you for a second, because I think you said the cartographers you didn't map out initially, right? So this book, how, and it's going to be a larger conversation about world building, but how much of the world did you know before going into the book, and that choose your own adventure style, how complicated was that?
It was super complicated because I also did not map this one out.
Wow, how is that possible?
I don't know. I really don't know. I think because I was afraid that when I started writing this one, because it's about multiple versions of a woman's life, that if I mapped it out, it would feel engineered. And so I just thought, if I can write it without an outline, that must mean that every choice she makes, and I can manage to remember all those choices, it must mean that each of those choices is like really authentic to her, right? And I think, I don't know, I am curious about everyone else too, whether you're kind of more of a plotter, an outliner, or a fly by the seat of your pants, or I'm definitely that one.
Let's go down, we'll start with you, Djèlí. Are you a plotter?
Oh, no, I'm an outliner. I'm an academic
Tell us your
historian by
ways.
trade.
How do you do it? How does it work?
How does it work? Outlining? Yeah, I don't understand people who, so Barta said, I'm an academic historian by trade, so academic writing, you outline your stuff, so I just transferred it. So, yeah, I don't understand people who do things like just write, or just, or they'll like, oh, I write the climax first, or the middle first. I'm like, what does that even mean? And so, no, I'm a definitive outliner. I can veer. I leave myself space to veer. Sometimes whole new characters show up, but no, I need to know where I started, where I'm going.
Jed?
I'm an obsessive outliner, but I'm also an obsessive destroyer of my outlines. Like, once I am on the page writing, I inevitably find somewhere else to go, and then I have to go back to the outline, and it's just a great big mess, but it ends up working more or less, and I've come to accept it.
Jed Berry, destroyer of outlines. I like that, yeah. GennaRose?
I think it depends on the form I'm writing in. When I'm writing short fiction, I tend to have, I start with a premise. I guess I like to plan backwards, by which I mean I will start with how I want the reader to feel when they're done. Like, what do I want them to walk away feeling and experiencing and reflecting on? And then from there, I move backwards and think, okay, well, what conclusion would create that feeling? And from that conclusion, I can think back and say, okay, what actions would have to happen to arrive at that conclusion? And theoretically, you can work all the way back to the beginning of a story in that way. So you can't always, it's very hypothetical. But I would say I often, if not always, know where it's going. I know what feeling I want it to end on. I don't necessarily know what actions are going to arrive at that feeling. So, yeah, and with short fiction, I definitely allow for more meandering, because I think it's a genre, or a form, I guess, that allows for a more vibes-based approach, where with a novel, I think the reader has committed to spending such a significant chunk of their life with you that I feel like you owe them a certain kind of payoff in a way. And so for a novel, I'm much more structured in pre-planning that outline. With my first novel, Thistlefoot, I basically knew how it started, how it ended, and a few things that would happen in between, and then in between that was kind of wiggly. And I wanted to try to be more structured with my next one. And so the one I'm currently writing is, I literally planned every single chapter, and I thought that would make it easier. It didn't make it easier. It actually kind of made it feel sort of forced, like you were saying about, yeah, it feels constructed, so I'm trying to give myself permission to destroy it, like Jed does. But yeah, I don't know, and I think it depends on the book, it depends on the project, what it asks for from you.
Yeah, and I do want to come back to short stories, especially with 50 Beasts, because I have a bunch of questions there too. I want to go down, Sarah Beth, are you a plotter, or are you?
I outline, but sort of a bare bones little bullet points, and then 3/4 of the way through it usually says, and then something awesome happens. And then I start writing and completely ignore the outline. I think a lot of writing is about just flat out believing in yourself and trusting your intuitive sense of what story is. I mean, we've all absorbed so many stories since we were 2, you know? So just trusting that sense of you know what you like, you know what works for you as a story, and going for that, and then trusting that you can fix it later if it didn't work.
And Chris?
So Sarah's point that she shifts is when she writes, and then something awesome happens, and mine is, and then the shit hits the fan. I've done a lot of collaborating as well, and so in collaboration, I always tend to be more focused on the outline, how to make sure so that we're in love with the same ideas. But when it's my own stuff, I feel like my job is sort of to set up dominoes. And if you've done a good job, then the dominoes will fall in a really exciting way. And if you haven't, then the thing's gonna fall apart and you have to figure out how to fix it. But yeah, I never wanna know the ending. I'm not nearly clever enough. Not nearly clever enough to do it that way. I never wanna know the ending because I feel like if it's easy for me to understand the ending before I get there, it's easy to predict maybe for some readers. But I also always know how I want them to feel. So I don't know.
I want to stay on you for a second, Chris, but I want to talk to the whole panel about genre as cultural commentary. I hate the word genre because it's just literature, right? And it bugs me, and it's part of the reason why we created this festival. But Chris, something that you said stuck with me. You wrote, I've been writing full-time for 24 of my, I think it's longer now, mostly in horror and fantasy, trying to lure people into the realization that although horror is about fear, it's also about hope. And I think that does maybe go to cultural commentary. I don't think it's a coincidence that during the pandemic, especially, horror boomed. So I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
I mean, we could spend a lot of time, but I'll just say that, Sarah was talking about what cozy fantasy does, and weirdly, horror does something that's almost the polar opposite of cozy fantasy, but I like to think that the end result is the same, because horror, and not that cozy fantasy is comedy, but horror and comedy are sort of the opposite sides of the same coin, because they're both these catalysts for emotion, right? And if you can get somebody into that heightened state of emotion, whether it's laughter or of terror, but at the end they get to leave the movie theater or close the book, and they get to have that exhalation. They get to feel, even subconsciously, that everything is okay, that everything is going to be okay. And I think that horror is a place where, especially in times of dire circumstance that we've been living in for quite some time now, you can go to feel okay, but you can also go to sort of help process the things that you're going through. And so in a weird way, no matter how terrifying and unstable the ground may be beneath you while you're reading this story or watching this story, when it's over, I feel like you feel safer. I know it's counterintuitive, but I think it's true.
Okay, on that note, because Sarah, you went from the Queen of Blood series to cozy fantasy, so I wonder if there's a connection there with what Chris was saying.
There absolutely is. Queen of Blood is an epic fantasy, and at the end of writing it, I had to write an apology letter to all the characters I killed off. So it is slightly different than cozy fantasy, but it does have that hope at its core. I firmly believe that fantasy literature is a literature of hope and empowerment. It is kind of the extreme sport of hope in a way, because you are putting these characters through this cauldron of anything that could happen. You're creating these impossible worlds in which they could actually literally be eaten by a dragon. And you get to see whether the characters survive or break. And I think one of the beauty of a fantasy book is you get to close it and say to yourself, well, if they could do that, I can face the dragons in my life. And it can give you the strength to go on. It can give you that deep breath, that encouragement, that power to go deal with the things that are going on in the real world.
So vote.
Anyone else thoughts on that, or?
So in addition to being an author, I'm also a folklorist and a folklore ethnologist, which means I study the social and psychological functions of folklore. Or in other words, why do we tell the stories that we tell? As a writer, that's really appealing to me because it sort of teaches that stories are not frivolous. Stories are essential to our survival and essential for us just to be able to keep our shit together as a society, essentially. And in folklore, you learn very quickly that no story about monsters is about monsters. Every story about monsters is about people, right? Any story in general is about people. And so no matter how fantastical you get, what you're really talking about is us people, is every story is a mirror of the culture that tells it. And so almost every folktale, or I would argue every folktale that exists because people feel the need to talk about something that they can't talk about directly. So, for example, vampire folklore was often used as a way to discuss tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is not something that you could kill. If a loved one was dying of consumption, that was outside of your control. That was not something that you could affect or kill. A vampire, on the other hand, you can kill. And so I think in terms of the way that particularly speculative fiction affects culture and reflects culture, it gives us a sense of control over that which we lack control over. And most fascinatingly, I think, it allows us to process things that may be too frightening or too taboo to speak aloud, but still address them. So it creates this sort of veil that allows us as a society to safely process and safely discuss issues we really desperately need to process and discuss, but while still feeling a sort of safe shield around us, separating us from that subject.
And Djèlí, you do that with historical realities, right? So can you talk a little bit about bringing history into your
I mean, sure, I guess talking about it in the larger sense that we've been talking about. Yeah, social commentary, politics is always a part of any type of storytelling. I know there are people who are like, hey, keep politics out of my Star Trek. Keep politics outside of my Star Wars, the movie about space Nazis. But of course, all of it is. But for me, it's, you know, it's degrees. And so for some of my works, most people know my works. I do a lot of alternate history work, and I throw a lot of magic in there. So, you know, some things are, I have a novella I wrote called Ring Shout, which is set in 1920s rural Georgia, and it's about 3 black women who are hunting monsters called Ku Kluxes after the coming of the film Birth of a Nation, because it turns out D.W. Griffith was a sorcerer and he did a spell and it's caused mayhem. That's pretty on the nose when it comes to politics and social commentary. So is a short story I wrote called The Secret Lives of the 9 Negro Teeth of George Washington, which is about President Washington holding in his possession the actual 9 teeth of enslaved people that he may or may not have used in his own dentures. Very social commentary. And then I have, you know, and it's pulling on history. And then I have stuff like what I wrote now called The Dead Cattail Assassins, which is, there's some history in there, but it's really just fantasy story, right? It's probably, when I say in degrees, right? So it's probably the least social commentary type story I have. And yet I managed to put bits of social commentary in there. Like there's a part, people have been telling me about this part because I guess it hit with folks, where there are a group of errant, annoying young magicians, these dudes who are magicians and they like pushing the envelope in magic, even if it hurts other people. And I decided to call them edgelords. And so, you know, that has its own bit of commentary. And so, you know, like I said, I think it's a matter of degrees. Some stories, there's no doubt that I'm trying to say something heavy, and others, like this last one, it's really a lighthearted story, but there are little dots here and there of commentary.
Thank you, guys. I want to go to Jed next, and I'm looking at that cover, and that's what's doing it for me, because I want to talk in general about covers in fantasy, but what a beautiful cover. Can you talk a little bit about this book, The Naming Song, and then I want to go back to your debut, because I have a bunch of questions about that too, but I'd love to hear about The Naming Song.
Sure, yeah. This novel, The Naming Song, was conceived really out of a set of images that I started with, which often happens, and I had this phrase in my mind, which was, oh, thank you, GennaRose. Post-apocalyptic Alice's Adventures in Wonderland on a train, and then I had to start filling in the details. What is this person doing on the train? Well, she's delivering something. What is she delivering? How about a word? Why is she delivering a word? Well, it's because language went away. And then I was in trouble because I had to write a book in which language was missing. And so it became a novel about reintroducing words into the world and kind of rebuilding the world as it happens. And you brought up genre, and it's very much in conversation with genre fiction. I find genre useful to the extent that you can think about it as a conversation. Looking back to past authors and looking at the tools they've deployed and thinking about how to use them in new ways or how to talk to the themes that they've raised, that sort of thing. And so it is very much a book about fantasy, about language, and but it's also like an adventure story because I just also wanted to have fun writing it, and so, yeah.
Yeah, and staying on you for a second, because I mean, you're all really interesting storytellers, obviously, and Jed, you work in different disciplines. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the family arcana.
Oh, sure. So the Family Arcana is a story in cards. It was published as a poker deck. The idea is that there's a piece of the story written on each card, and you can shuffle it and read it in any order. It's a kind of a gothic story about a haunted family, sort of based a little bit on my own family, some members of which are in the audience. Hi, guys. And it's, you know, it was an experiment in form, obviously, but it came about kind of accidentally because I was just writing on index cards, and I found these short bursts of story were working really well, and then I needed to find a way to contain them, and so a deck of 52 cards
That's so cool.
was how it fit, yeah.
Very cool, thank you. And I mentioned covers, so I do want to talk about covers because covers in fantasy art, so important going back to the pulps, right? So, Chris, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of covers, especially in fantasy, sci-fi, and horror.
Beforehand, just indulge me for 1 second. I just wanted to say and follow up to what Djèlí was saying that I think we live in an environment right now where any piece of fiction in which the bad guy is the bad guy and the good guy is the good guy is political now. You know, like Star Wars, you're saying Star Wars, Star Trek. Anyway, it's crazy, but I think that so every act of writing a story about human struggles is a political act, I think. Anyway, covers. I got really lucky ever since I did a novel a few years ago called Road of Bones. And the cover designer and artist is a guy named Jonathan Bush. And Jonathan has done the last 4 books of mine. And he has this interesting skull theme that has been running through the books, but generally in a subtle way. So you have to really know that the House of Last Resort, that's a skull up there. And the irony for me is that it's all marketing, right? If I could show you, I wish I could show you right now the British cover to this book, because the British cover of this book is the most 1970s garish horror, ridiculous. It's red and it's got a big demon-possessed rat on the cover. It could not be more opposite from this book, but in the UK, the greatest number of sales for my stuff happen in Asda supermarkets. And so the Asda salespeople or the buyers have a say. And they're like, well, you know, we like that. That will sell to our supermarket customers. So really, it's just, it's luck and it's different tastes and it's, you think that the British would be more highbrow, but apparently not in the supermarket. But yeah, I don't know. It makes such a huge difference because the cover is telling all kinds of stories on all kinds of layers to potential readers and potential buyers, and you never quite know.
And to that point, Sarah, I know I look like a cozy fantasy reader. I'm not, but your cover and the purple pages, that's what I saw in the bookstore, and I bought it the day it came out. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the cover is a promise for what's going to be inside, a promise of what kind of journey you're going to get on. And this one, the artist is named Lulu Chan. She also did some of the animation for the Spider-Verse movies, which I think is so cool. And I desperately want to live inside this cottage. Usually the author doesn't have that much control over what the cover is. So if the cover doesn't match the book, or if you hate the cover, please don't blame the author. It's not our fault. In this case, I'm thrilled with it because this is exactly what the book is. And my involvement was sending them a Pinterest mood board of lots of pictures of cottages and flowers and stuff. And now all my Pinterest recommendations are cottages, and I am not mad about that at all.
And GennaRose, your friend illustrated this book, correct? 50 Beasts.
Yeah, so, well, not the cover. The cover I'm in love with this cover. I think it's just so stunning. But in the interior of the book, yeah, thanks, man. So, essentially, 50 Beasts to Break Your Heart is a short story collection. The titular short story is in the form of a mythical bestiary, which I'm not sure how many of you have heard of a bestiary, but essentially they were this encyclopedic form, primarily in the Middle Ages, in which monks would create these compendiums of all the known animals. And they were often allegorical. So for example, I became deeply obsessed with them because of the way that these animals are illustrated and described. So for example, these monks had not seen many of the animals that they were drawing. So, you know, when they're like, a hippopotamus, it's kind of like a horse in the water. Can you draw that? And suddenly you have like a mer horse as a hippopotamus. My favorites are, they thought that hedgehogs had spikes so that the hedgehogs could just like roll in a pile of grapes and get a grape stuck to each spike and then go home to their children, and then the children would eat the grapes off of the spikes. So every medieval illustration of a hedgehog just has it chalk covered in grapes. Like, it's incredible. Google it. They also thought goats were so sexy that their blood could melt diamonds. Like, the monks saw a goat and were like, yeah, that's a sexy one. And so anyway, suffice to say, I became deeply obsessed with this form, and so the titular story in 50 Beasts to Break Your Heart is a bestiary of my own invention with creatures I made up. And I had always dreamt of, if it came out, if it was published, that it would be fully illustrated. And so I had my friend Bobby Detrani illustrate every single one of these beasts, which was really fun and exciting because, you know, I obviously had an image in my head of what each of these strange creatures looked like, but I didn't describe anything beyond what was on the page to him. I just handed it to him and waited to see what was born. And yeah, the little freaks that he came up with are just incredible. And yeah, I love collaborating, especially collaborating with friends. I think there's something really exciting and just like heartwarming, especially being on like a professional level of publishing now, to be able to work with like my buddies to create this art that then goes out all over the world is like, just, it really tickles me. And so, yeah, it was such a privilege to be able to team up with him on this.
And just sticking on 50 Beasts for a second, I know, I think I heard you in an interview say that their stories collected from, you know, the oldest story is 12 or 13 years old that you'd written it. But the through line is really yearning and longing. Could you talk about that a little bit and how you put the collection together?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I think the oldest story in the collection is about 11 years old, and then the newest one I wrote when we were in the editing stage about 2 years ago. And so it really does span, essentially it's like a compendium of my 20s in a way. And yeah, the theme in every story is different explorations on longing and yearning and sort of the perpetual humiliation of human desire, which wasn't a theme I deliberately wrote every single story about. That's just what I think about. And so yeah, a lot of them are stories that I wrote to process different experiences and relationships and pinings that I was experiencing as a person in my 20s. And the way that I think of, kind of to go back to the concept of genre, for lack of a better word, these stories are all what I would call magical realism. And the way I think about that is it's just a turning up of the volume knob on how it feels to be a person. So, you know, in one of the stories in this collection, a woman is trying to make herself sort of more appealing and hospitable to her partner, and so she literally begins to turn into a house. In another story, there is a boy who is starting to experience sort of the tangled world of human attachment, and he's literally made of thread that is snagging on person after person that he falls in love with. And so for me, these are real stories. They may seem fantastical on the surface, but it's just, to me, a literal an accurate representation of how it feels to be a person. A turning up of that volume knob where you're like, oh, this is how it feels. What if that was physically true? What if the logic of the world matched, what if the external logic of the world matched the internal logic of the characters? And what would that look like?
You mentioned magical realism, and Jed, I wanted to talk to you about your first book is The Manual of Detection, and the unnamed city in that book is a New York city in the 40s where it always rains, and then there's a magical carnival that shows up, right? So I wonder if you could talk about magical realism in your work as well.
Sure. I mean, I guess technically it's not a term that I've claimed, but I do think a lot about. One of my favorite writers, Italo Calvino, talked about fantasy as the revolt of the unconscious, and it's a phrase I keep going back to, and it's something that was important in that book, where I was imagining, this like rainy cityscape, which is kind of the world of the mundane in some way, but then there's this eruption of nonsense and unreason from within, and exploring the sort of boundaries between that ordered world and the chaotic world is to me just a really compelling place to dwell. Maybe because, that's part of my brain, I guess, as I'm always trying to find a shape and an order, but also like embrace the chaos as necessary. So so the Manual of Detection though has a detective novel structure, which I think like cozy fantasy and horror actually, there's some similarities there in the way there can be the comfort of the familiar movements of the plot, the promise that the mystery is going to be solved and the answers that will be provided. But by disrupting it a bit with the fantastic, I think there are ways to mess with those expectations and complicate it. And that's what I was going for with that book.
And Peng, in all this and more, one of the main themes is reality versus happiness. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it was kind of, so whenever I start writing, like I said, I don't plan or outline, but I'm usually starting with some kind of a central question. And in the case of all this and more, I think because we were all in lockdown and really thinking about our lives, my question was, is it better to be happy or for like something to be true, because I think a lot of us did want to just escape into some fantasy or pretend that this hadn't happened or that it wasn't as serious as it was, and because that would be better and easier, right? And or we didn't want to face some of the bad choices that we'd made in the past, so we just would rather not think about them or ignore them or like rewrite, try to rewrite history. And that, I think that's where the idea for this book came from, and it's set in a game show. That is the way that the main character gets to go back in time and fix these regrets that she has in her life. The game show can send her back in time to very specific moments in her past, and she's got 10 episodes to do it. So there's still like even though it has multiple paths, and you can really choose a lot. There are 10 episodes, and whatever her life is at the finale, or your life is at the finale, that's what you're stuck with. And so it that's how it came together structurally, but also thematically.
Thank you. So we're just about out of time on this panel, so I want to go down because StoryFest is about what you're reading. Chris, you do such a great job of promoting other writers on your socials, so I think you're a great place to start. What are you reading? And then if we could go down the line on what everybody's reading, and then you guys are gonna do a signing in the room right behind us.
I mean, I actually have a stack of a bunch of stuff I've agreed to blurb. So, but what I'm reading right now actually is Dracula. I'm rereading it for the first time in decades for a project, and that's a whole other panel. I love it so much. But I've also recently read our friend Gabino Iglesias' House of Rain and Bone, and it's amazing. So, Sarah?
I've been reading a lot of cozy fantasy. I feel very strongly that you should write what you love, and you should read what you love, and you should bring as much joy and story into your life as you possibly can. So I'd recommend Can't Spell Treason Without T by Rebecca Thorne, and Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. I've really, really loved both of those.
I'm reading, this is my worst nightmare. It's every author's worst nightmare, because now I can't remember the first name of the
I should have
author.
mentioned this before we went up
I
here.
know. Okay, so it's called The Bee Sting, and it's either Paul or Sean Murray. I think it's Paul. Paul Murray? Okay. It's called The Bee Sting. It's fabulous. I just can't stop reading it. It's just, I don't know, there's something about you just can't stop.
I'm reading The Book of Love by Kelly Link, who has been a short story hero for many years, and this is her first novel. And she's my favorite author, so like I'm gonna love anything she puts out. But there's something about this is like a chunk of a novel. It's for a short story writer to go from writing short stories to suddenly writing. I think at some point her draft was 500,000 words. She like wrangled it a little bit, but not much. And so it just feels like floating in. I was describing to Jed yesterday, it feels to me like floating in like a very heavily salted lake of Kelly's brain, which is just a dream for me, where I'm just like, put me in this sensory deprivation tank of just like shoving myself into my favorite author's head and like fucking leave me there. And so, it's great. I'm loving it, having a great time.
I'm often reading a book and listening to an audiobook, and right now I am reading Afterworld by Debbie Urbanski, which is fantastic. It is a post-apocalyptic novel in which a sort of advanced computer system is telling the life story of the last living woman on Earth. It is devastating and really beautiful. And I'm listening to The Master of Jinn, actually. Do you go by Fen or?
No, any of those. It's
okay.
pen name, so.
Okay, sure. Highly recommended. A really wonderful reader that you have for that, I thought.
Yes, they do. She does phenomenal.
Yeah.
So whenever I'm asked this, I always forget, so I have to look up what I'm reading. So I'm reading The Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael Chabon, which is a really interesting alternate world book. Let's see, the things that I've just read that I really liked that stayed with me. Magical realism, if you want to call it that. Jesmond Ward's Let Us Descend. And then I saw Dark Matter on Apple TV, so then I had to go read stuff by Crouch, and so I just read Recursions by Crouch, and that's still sitting in my head. And so,
Thank you. Sorry to put everyone on the spot, but thank you. Thank you all for being here. To this panel and to all the StoryFest authors, this is the honor of my job here. So thank you guys so much for being here. This was great. What a way to start StoryFest, guys. They'll be signing in Comanche Room back here right after this panel, and we've got panels throughout the day. Thank you all.
Can we take a